Welcome back to my channel for another medium format photography episode. And this episode is about combining the Fuji GFX100s with an HC lens from the Hasselblad full medium format system. And I use for this an adapter which is natively from Fujifilm, and I will go all into the details in a moment. Let's kick off the video. In the last few years, medium format photography has become very popular, and this was clearly driven by the Fuji GFX camera system, but also by the Hasselblad X system and the V system, where you have a digital back, like in the big brother setup on the Hasselblad HC here in front of me on the table. In terms of sensor size, there is a significant difference between these cameras here and the Hasselblad X system and a Hasselblad H6D or a Phase 1 IQ4, because these cameras here, so the H6D and the IQ4, they have a sensor dimension of 53.4 times 40 millimeter, whereas on the Hasselblad X system and the Fuji GFX system, you have a sensor size of 44 times 33 millimeter. And that's why I call these type of sensors a crop medium format, and this is what I call the full medium format. So we have full medium format, 53.4 millimeter times 40 millimeter. We have crop medium format, 44 times 33 millimeter, and unfortunately Fuji carries the confusion to a new level by calling the crop medium format large format sensors. And large format film photography is of course something totally different than shooting with a digital camera with a crop medium format sensor. So be careful here with the nomenclature and don't be confused. The lens I'm going to shoot in this video is the Hasselblad HC 80mm, and its widest open aperture is an f2.8, and it's also the newer version, because you see here an orange square, and that indicates that this is a newer version of the HC 80mm, which can be updated in its firmware and has more features and, most importantly, a faster shutter speed in the leaf shutter in the lens. The HC 80mm is the standard lens for the Hasselblad H6D, and whenever you look into medium format film cameras, for instance the Mamiya RC67, which you find in a video reviewed on my channel, or you look into the Rolleiflex 2.8 GX, which is a video which will come in the next months, or you look into the Hasselblad H6D, or you look into the Phase 1 IQ4, 80mm typically is the standard focal length in full medium format, be it for a full medium format sensor or be it for 120 film. Now, the HC 80mm is actually one of the best lenses I've ever shot in my whole life, and that means something because I've shot a lot of lenses, in particular also at 80mm, and it's a super sharp, super crisp, very well performing lens with great optical properties, and you will see later in the sample images that this is probably very hard to top in terms of lenses mounted on the Fuji GFX camera system. There are various options in terms of adapters which enable you to mount a Hasselblad HC lens on a Fuji GFX camera. What I have chosen here is the original adapter from Fujifilm, and it's called the H-mount adapter G, and it also has here on the other side a function button for some settings, which I will show in a moment in the course of the video. And that adapter has a few advantages to no-name adapters. Let me quickly unmount the lens. First of all, you see here a bunch of electronic contacts. That means the adapter communicates electronically with the camera body. Second, if I unmount here for a moment the Hasselblad lens, you find the contacts also here, and these contacts communicate with the contacts of the HC 80mm. And that means you get a full readout into the image file in terms of metadata on the chosen aperture, on your shutter speed, and on a bunch of parameters, which is very helpful. And you also can fully steer the lens with all the control elements on the camera body. And that is something I highly appreciate, and you don't get if you purchase cheaper adapters who do not have these electronic contacts and communicate between the camera body and the lens all the data which you process in the course of your shooting. In the datasheet of the lens, Hasselblad also specifies what the full frame equivalent focal length of the HC 80mm is, but with respect to the Hasselblad H6D sensor, which is a full medium format sensor compared to a crop medium format sensor like we have it in the Fuji GFX. So we have to be careful here. And if you would actually try to generate the same field of view which you get if you shoot the HC 80mm on the H6D and you would try to replicate this in a full frame setup, then you would have to shoot a 55.5mm lens on a full frame sensor. That's what you actually can get out of the datasheet, but it doesn't help you if you mount the HC 80mm on a Fuji GFX100s with a different sensor dimension than what you have on the Hasselblad H60. And the solution to the question, what is the full frame equivalent focal length of the HC 80mm if it is shot on a GFX instead on an H60, is actually very simple. An 80mm focal length is always an 80mm focal length, independently whether it's shot on a Fuji GFX camera or on a Hasselblad H60. And what the crop factor actually means, it only translates the field of view we get on this camera lens combination into an equivalent field of view on a full frame camera. And that is what we have to figure out. And because the crop factor of the GFX sensor is 0.79, we actually have to multiply 80mm with 0.79 and end up at a 63mm full frame equivalent focal length. And that is what we have to do here. So it's different, and you cannot use the Hasselblad spec sheet for this lens to figure out what your equivalent focal length in a full frame setup is. Now, if you think about what I just said, that might confuse some people watching this video. So if we look actually into the spec sheet of that lens, we find a full frame equivalent focal length of give or take 55mm, and I just said a moment before, no, the full frame equivalent field of view and focal length of this camera lens combo is actually 63mm. So in order to convince you, finally we'll do a little experiment and we'll replace the adapter and the HC 80mm by the native 80mm lens in the GFX system, and you will see that this is exactly the same field of view. And then of course, if we have now a native GFX lens shot on the GFX camera body, we know how to translate focal length, namely by multiplying 80mm or this 80mm here by 0.79 and then end up at the full frame equivalent focal length of 63mm, and that procedure I've shown many times on my channel. So let's quickly do this. Let's get the H60 out of sight here, a little bit on the sideline. Let's take a shot with that camera lens combo here. So this is, by the way, a manual focusing lens, and you have a very nice, very soft but sufficient resistance focus ring here, and you also have a scale here where you see where you're focusing, and it's a very fine scale. So here, for instance, is infinity, and the near distance which you can get here is 0.7 meter, which is also not unusual. Typically it's 1 meter for medium format lenses, which means with that lens here you can get very close to also macro or close-up type shootings. I come to that later in the further specifications of the lens. And now let's take a shot with that camera lens combination here, and I have on my dedicated function button here the zoom for manual focus, so we can zoom in and then we can focus here and can try to get this sharp and in a way that the image looks nice. I think here we go. I do this quick and dirty here because of course on the 80mm native GFX lens we have autofocus in a moment. That makes life much easier. Let's take a shot. Here we go. And we actually shot this widest open at f2.8 and with auto ISO and an aperture priority mode. So now we have a shot. Let's now remove that adapter lens combo here. Let's put it aside. And let's do the same shot with the 80mm lens from the Fuji GFX system. So let me mount this quickly here. Since we switched now from a manual focusing lens to an autofocus lens, we can actually here on that control switch go to S for single shooting, and then we should also have autofocus. I also use the same aperture as what I used on the HC 80mm, namely 2.8. So let's take a shot and let's quickly compare the two shots if they have exactly the same field of view. And if they have, then of course the crop factor to be applied to this combination here is 0.79, and in the same way if we would mount the adapter with the HC 80mm lens, which confirms what I said before, and where I said bear in mind 80mm is always 80mm. It doesn't change the focal length just because you mount a lens on a camera body with a different sensor dimension. But if you switch between different sensor sizes, and crop factor typically relates with respect to a full frame sensor size, then you have to take into account from what sensor type you are coming and what sensor you are migrating to, which typically is full frame. And then the full frame equivalent of this lens here, the HC 80mm, actually is 63mm and not a 55 you see in the spec sheet, and if you would have mounted it on the H60 from Hasselblad. Here's the outcome from a little focal length experiment. On the left hand side we have the H mount adapter to G and the HC 2.8 80mm. On the right hand side We have the same camera body, the GFX100s, but the native GF 80mm f1.7. And now if we compare this is exactly the same field of view, maybe on the left hand side a tiny little bit more narrow in the field of view because, as I mentioned before, the effective focal length of the Hasselblad lens is not 80mm but a tiny little bit longer, but it is, give or take, the same field of view. For the sake of completeness, I have here a comparison on the left hand side, the GFX and the HC 80mm, and on the right hand side I've now shot a 55mm Carl Zeiss lens on a Sony Alpha 1, and you see how different the field of view is, and that the 55.5mm from the spec sheet of the lens definitely do not apply as a full frame equivalent focal length if you mount the HC 80mm on a Fuji GFX100s. So I hope everyone watching this video is now convinced that the full frame equivalent focal length of this setup here, camera, adapter, lens, is around 63mm and not the 55mm we found in the spec sheet. Alright, what else do I want to share about this lens? First of all, widest open f2.8, we saw that on the lens. We have a weight of 475 grams, so the lens is not overly heavy, but you also have to count in the weight of the adapter, which is another 210 grams, and then of course the weight of the camera body. But I found in my shooting, in particular since I have everything set up here for my thumb, quite convenient to do the manual focusing. Having a firm grip here and shooting with that lens on the GFX100s was just very much enjoyable. A few more data points maybe. So the filter thread here is 67mm, and the minimum distance object to film, as we saw before when we used the scale here, is 0.7 meter, which brings you to a maximum reproduction ratio or magnification of 1 divided by 6.5, which is actually quite good for medium format lenses because this is almost a close-up type setup here. The GFX100s has under the IQ menu a menu entry which is called Mount Adapter Setting. And if I go into that setting, I get two sections here, Shutter Select and Lens Registration. And the nice thing is that I can also access this directly here from that function button. And I will push that function button now and we look together into the menu so you can see what I can do with it. So I push it now, and then this menu entry opens, and I have two options here on Shutter Select. I can use the shutter in the body, including the electronic shutter, and that's very convenient, and of course also the mechanical shutter, or I can go for the shutter in the lens. And these Hasselblad lenses, so the HC 80mm and typically the Hasselblad lineup, you have a leaf shutter in the lens, and if I choose that, this enables me to shoot with a much faster flash swing speed, up to 1/2000 seconds. And that's of course very, very nice for studio photography. And I really appreciate that we have this option here. And then I can register my lens. And I used here, of course, the 80mm. And remember what I said before, 80mm is 80mm, independent of on what camera body you mounted it. And that is important to make the in-body image stabilization via sensor shift working in the camera body of the GFX100s. And it works absolutely flawless if you want to use longer exposure times handhold instead of having the camera on a tripod, and fully leverages the sensor stabilization we have here if we use that Hasselblad HC 80mm lens. And then there are further things I can tweak here. First of all, I named that, so I gave it a name, Hasselblad 80mm here, to remember it, and whenever I mount that lens I can use it. And then I have also certain corrections from the optical side. So we have distortion correction for barrel and pin cushion. We have here color shading correction, and that is very nice. Of course, we have peripheral illumination correction. Let's go into it. So you can do some corrections here and correct for certain optical aspects of your lens. And you also can edit the lens name, which I did, as I mentioned before, Hasselblad 80mm f2.8. So that's quite nice. And since you have that function button here sitting right on the lens adapter, you also have easy access, and I think is a very good solution Fuji has implemented here. That's why I also recommend, if you want to shoot HC lenses on your GFX camera, use the original adapter from Fujifilm. You will get much more than if you have some other adapters, which for instance do not transport information and have a lack of electronic contacts and all of that. There is one tiny little detail I forgot to mention, namely that the adapter here from Fuji comes with an additional accessory for mounting it on a tripod, and you don't need this for the HC 80mm because you have, as I said before, with the adapter and the lens less than 700 grams of weight, so you can easily use the tripod mount at the bottom of the camera. But if you work with other H lenses, they can be very huge and super heavy, and then it's very convenient to have that additional accessory to mount via the adapter the lens camera combo on a tripod and have the weight and the burden on the adapter and not on the camera mount itself. So that is something I forgot to mention, I wanted to quickly add here. And in general, I think the image quality, we'll look into sample images in a moment, is absolutely terrific. Is, as I said, something of the best I've ever seen. One of the best lenses I've ever shot on the GFX100s. So let's go into sample images and then let's conclude the video. Combining the Hasselblad HC 80mm with the Fuji GFX100s creates an absolute dream combo, period. This is something of the best in terms of image quality, sharpness, where the focus was sitting, manual focus as I said before, but also the softness of the background bokeh and the background blurriness I've ever seen on my cameras. And that means a lot because I shoot a lot of cameras and even more lenses. Here's one of the images you saw before in that little slideshow, and look how soft the background blurriness is, how nice this bokeh is rendered. Most of the images I've shot widest open at f2.8, and here we have 1/240 seconds and an ISO of 200 and a resolution beyond 100 megapixel of course. And if I crop in here by 100%, this is absolutely brilliant. And of course you need to understand manual focusing, you need to get used to it. But it's absolutely brilliant how sharp the eye, the eyelashes, everything is in this face here. And at the same time how soft and circular the background lights appear in this background blurriness. Absolutely fantastic. Here another image shot widest open at f2.8, and I think the transition between sharp foreground and background is exactly what distinguishes medium format photography from everything that has a smaller sensor. And if you look at that image here, this is pinpoint sharp where I was manually focusing, and then in the background everything is soft, pleasant, and looks just very aesthetic. Speaking about separation of foreground and background, we just saw in the image before, and also talking about transition, here is actually an image where you see that transition in a very nice way, which makes medium format so much superior to anything else with a smaller sensor. So if we look here, here is where the focus is sitting. Now let's move out here. You see in the foreground here, the stones on that wall are very sharp, and then it transitions towards the horizon in a very soft way. You still see here indicated the stickers, and then it transitions even more and becomes very, very soft. And the more you have the distance between the foreground and the background, the more pleasant and more soft the background appears. And that is something which is very nice, of course. The level of sharpness again in this image, absolutely breathtaking. And I think it was absolutely no problem focusing this HC 80mm lens manually, because you have focus peaking, you have the magnification, which I customized on that button I showed before. And with that, it works like a charm. I didn't even miss autofocus in the whole shooting I had with this camera lens combo. Here a couple of more images again which show the absolute brilliance and sharpness of this lens. Again, look at the eye here and the eyelashes. Same story here. Let's have a look. Let's crop in by 100%. Absolutely pinpoint sharp, and the resolution fully replicated from the 100 megapixel sensor via the HC 80mm lens, of course, because it's calculated for an H6D 100C, which has also 100 megapixel, and because the image circle was calculated for a larger sensor than what I actually use in the Fuji GFX100s. Same here, very sharp, brilliant image. Look at the details here in that face, really good. And also here, of course, if I crop in here by 100%, sorry, looks really good, always sharp, manual focus, absolutely no problem. And of course, you can also go here for landscape if you want. I mean, that focal length of, let's say 63 millimeter with some compression effect coming from the tail in here. You can also use this for panorama stitching, which I did here. Let's go in here. So here's the image, is now 185.5 megapixel and is one of the main bridges here in Zurich and is absolutely sharp. This was shot at this time not widest open as most of my images, but at an aperture of f8.0 and 1/680 seconds and an ISO of 200. And there is so much detail you can recognize in these images, and you can also go by panorama stitching, of course, beyond the 100 megapixel and get a lot more detail and a much higher resolution for even larger prints. So that all looks really, really good in my opinion. And I'm very happy with the results. This is not the last time I've shot the HC 80mm on the Fuji GFX100s. And of course, the next experiment to come will be to shoot the new Hasselblad X2D with HC lenses from the H6D100C camera. And that is something a lot of people have asked for, which I'm going to do in the next weeks. And of course, I will post my shooting experience and sample images here on my channel. And I hope you liked that video and you got some appetite to shoot H lenses from the Hasselblad H6D system on your Fuji GFX camera, be it the 50R, the 50S2, or you know, the 100S or the 100, what have you. You can use this on all these camera bodies, and I hope also the image quality convinced you that this is an absolutely fantastic combination here, and that you get a medium format type experience going beyond of what you already have on the Fuji GFX, because these optics are calculated for larger sensors, namely the 53.4 times 40mm sensors, therefore have a larger image circle, therefore you have only the sweet spot of the lens, namely everything close to the center, and that of course delivers these images I've shown before. If you liked that video, don't forget to drop me a thumbs up, stay tuned on my channel, there is always more to come. Thanks for watching, stay safe and healthy, and of course, peace out.